Can you even begin to comprehend what it means to be abandoned by your own family on a freezing winter's night? I'm not talking about being forgotten at a restaurant or left behind on a trip. I'm talking about being literally left out in the brutal cold by the only people in the world who should care whether you live or die. This is the story of Walter Harrison, a 73-year-old man who learned in the most brutal way imaginable that familial love can possess far colder limits than any temperature nature can conjure. It was a Tuesday in December when everything changed for Walter. Snow had begun to fall early that morning, and the weather forecast warned of one of the worst winter storms in decades. Temperatures of -15 degrees, winds of 60 kilometers per hour, and enough snow to render roads impassable. Walter sat in the living room of his son David's home, watching through the window as snowflakes danced in the frigid air. He had moved in 6 months earlier, following a mild stroke that had left his left side slightly weakened and his memory a bit muddled. Walter Harrison wasn't always a burden on the family. 3 years prior, he was still a vibrant, retired carpenter, known in the community for building homes for low-income families without charging a penny. A man who had raised 4 children largely on his own after his wife succumbed to cancer when they were still teenagers. For 40 years, Walter had been the bedrock of the family. He worked double shifts to keep a roof over their heads, taught his children about responsibility and honesty, and never, not once, complained about the sacrifices he made for them. David, Michael, Sarah, and Rebecca grew up knowing they could count on their father for anything. When David lost his job and needed money to avoid losing his home, Walter sold his car. When Michael battled drug problems in his youth, Walter paid for his rehabilitation. When Sarah went through a divorce, he looked after her grandchildren for 2 years so she could rebuild her life. But the stroke changed everything. Walter, who had always been independent and self-sufficient, now needed help with basic tasks. He sometimes forgot where he'd put things. He occasionally repeated stories he'd already told the day before. And, most distressingly, the family, he had become inconvenient. David and his wife, Jessica, began to see Walter not as the man who had sacrificed everything for his children, but as a problem to be solved. The hushed conversations in the kitchen became more frequent. The expressions of irritation when Walter needed assistance grew more overt. "Dad, don't you think you'd be better off in a place with specialized care?" David had suggested multiple times. But Walter always responded the same way. "Son, I raised the 4 of you in this house. All I want is to grow old with dignity by my family's side." That Tuesday in December, David came home from work with a look Walter had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was cold, calculated resignation. "Dad," David said, without even taking off his coat, "we need to talk." Jessica appeared from the kitchen, avoiding eye contact with Walter. The two of them positioned themselves in front of the armchair where Walter was sitting, as if they were about to deliver bad news to a stranger. "Dad, we've made a decision," David continued, his voice oddly formal. "We've found a place for you. A very nice nursing home, with specialized care." Walter felt his heart lurch. "But David, I thought we'd agreed. I don't want to go to a place like that. I want to stay with my family." "You don't understand," Jessica interrupted, finally looking at him. "It's not about what you want. It's about what's best for everyone." Walter tried to rise from the armchair, but his legs trembled, not from physical weakness, but from emotional shock. "What are you saying? That I'm a burden?" "It's not like that," David replied quickly, but his subsequent words entirely contradicted this assertion. "It's just, Jessica is pregnant. We are having a baby, and we simply can't look after you and a child." Walter looked from one to the other, processing the information. But I can help. I love children. I raised the 4 of you, remember? I could help with the baby." Jessica gave a bitter laugh. "Dad, Walter, you can barely remember to take your medication. How could you help with a newborn?" At this point, you're likely feeling a mixture of anger and sadness for Walter. Perhaps you're thinking about your own parents or grandparents, and how devastating it would be if they went through this. Hold on to that feeling, because it will be important for understanding what Walter did next. What happened next was so shocking that Walter later said he felt like he was watching a film about someone else's life. David went to the cupboard and took out an old suitcase, the very same one Walter had used when he moved in 6 months earlier. "We've already called Sunset Manor," David said, avoiding his father's gaze. "They have a vacancy immediately. You can move in tonight." "Tonight?" Walter repeated, incredulous. But it's snowing. And it's already dark." "They said it's fine," Jessica replied coldly. "In fact, it's better this way. Less fuss, less stress for everyone." Walter realized they weren't asking for his opinion. They were informing him of a decision already made. As if he were an object being relocated, not a human being with feelings and dignity. 30 minutes later, Walter stood at the front door with his single suitcase, staring at the heavily falling snow. David had started the car and left it running, but he didn't get out to help his elderly father with his luggage. "The GPS is already programmed with the address," David shouted from inside the car. "It's only a 20-minute drive." Walter looked at the house where he had been welcomed 6 months earlier, where he had expected to spend his remaining years surrounded by family and love. The windows were lit and warm, but he would no longer be welcome inside. He walked slowly to the car, each step in the snow more difficult than the last. Not because of the cold or his age, but because of the weight of rejection he carried on his shoulders. When they arrived at Sunset Manor, David didn't even turn off the engine. He just pointed to the building and said, "It's there, Dad. They're expecting you." Walter picked up his suitcase, got out of the car, and turned to wave goodbye to his son. But David was already reversing, eager to return home to his new family, the family that truly mattered, waiting for him. Walter stood on the footpath for a moment, watching the car's taillights disappear into the snow. It was then he realized something terrible had happened. When he tried to open the door to Sunset Manor, he found it was locked. There was a sign on the door, temporarily closed due to the storm's onset. David had abandoned him in front of a shuttered building during one of the worst winter storms in decades. At 73 years old, Walter Harrison was more alone than he'd ever imagined possible. But what he did next would surprise not just his family, but the entire community. Walter stood on the footpath for nearly 10 minutes, snow piling on his shoulders as he tried to process what had happened. Sunset Manor was completely dark, with a temporary sign he couldn't quite read due to the snow obscuring the glass. His hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the shock of realizing his own son had abandoned him without even checking if the place was open. David had sped off so quickly, clearly not bothered about ensuring Walter was safe. The temperature was plummeting. Walter could feel the biting wind cutting through his thin coat, the same coat David had bought him the previous year, back when he still pretended to care. Walter looked around, trying to orient himself in the storm. He was in a part of the city he didn't know well, far from anywhere familiar. There were no nearby houses with lights on, no open businesses, no obvious place to seek refuge. He could try walking back to David's place, but it was over 10 kilometers through the storm. With his physical condition after the stroke and his advanced age, that walk would be literally impossible. He could try calling one of his other children, but his old mobile had very little battery left and, more importantly, Walter was beginning to realize something painful. If David had the gall to abandon him like this, he'd likely discussed it with his siblings first. And so Walter Harrison, a man who had spent 73 years looking after others, made a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of dozens of others. As he shuffled along the footpath, searching for any sign of life, Walter noticed a faint light emanating from a small structure behind Sunset Manor. It appeared to be some kind of shed or workshop, with a chimney from which a small amount of smoke curled. Approaching cautiously, Walter discovered it was an abandoned carpentry workshop, likely from some aged care home maintenance project that had been halted. The door was unlocked, and inside, there were tools, wood, and most importantly, a small fireplace with some firewood. For a moment, Walter felt a tremendous sense of relief. He had found shelter. He could spend the night there, keep warm, and in the morning, he would figure out how to deal with his situation. But as he lit the fireplace and sat in an old chair to warm himself, something extraordinary happened. The tools around him, the smell of wood, the sound of the crackling fire, it all brought back memories of when Walter was an active carpenter. Sitting in that makeshift workshop, Walter remembered something he had forgotten in the difficult months since his stroke. He still knew how to do things. He still had skills. He could still create, build, contribute. His hands, despite the weakness on his left side, still knew how to hold a tool. His eyes, though aged, could still discern when something was crooked or needed mending. And then Walter realized something that would change the course of his life. The workshop was filled with half-finished projects, rusty tools that needed attention, and, crucially, there were signs everywhere that this place had been a refuge for others like him. There were forgotten coffee cups, old newspapers, and even a few photographs pinned to the wall, pictures of elderly men working with wood, smiling, looking useful and happy. Can you feel what was happening to Walter in that moment? That feeling of rediscovering something about yourself that you thought was lost? We all have moments in life where we forget our worth, our abilities, our capacity to contribute. Walter was about to rediscover it all in the most unexpected way. Walter spent the night organizing the workshop. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it was his job, but because doing something, anything useful, made him feel like himself again. He cleaned the tools, sorted the wood by type and size, and even repaired a broken chair he found in a corner. Working with his hands, even in the rough conditions and with his physical limitations, brought back a feeling Walter had lost in recent months, the feeling of being capable. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the storm raged outside, Walter felt more at peace than he had felt since his stroke. He wasn't a burden to anyone. He wasn't bothering no one. He was simply being useful. When the sun rose the next morning, Walter discovered something he hadn't noticed the night before due to the darkness and the storm. The workshop wasn't entirely derelict. There were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Someone had been here recently, and as Walter looked more closely, he realized there were signs that others used this space regularly. There were several clean mugs on a shelf, different kinds of projects in various stages of construction, and what surprised Walter most, a small wooden plaque hanging near the door that read, "The Forgotten's Refuge, all are welcome." Walter realized he had stumbled upon something extraordinary, a place where people like him, forgotten, rejected, abandoned people, came to find purpose again. Around 9 o'clock that morning, Walter heard voices from outside. 3 elderly men were approaching the workshop, chatting animatedly about some project. When they entered and saw Walter, there was a moment of surprise, but no hostility. Instead, the oldest man in the group, a white-haired gentleman with a warm smile, extended his hand. "Hello there, mate. I'm Harold. You must be new around here. Welcome to our little haven." Walter briefly explained his situation, how he'd been abandoned the previous night and found refuge in the workshop. Instead of the pity he expected, he received something far better, understanding. "We all have a similar story," Harold said gently. "Families who've decided we're inconvenient. Children who'd rather forget us. But here, we remind each other that we still have value." Harold explained how the workshop had come about. 3 years prior, he himself had been similarly abandoned by his family. Instead of giving up, he'd found this abandoned space and started using it to work with wood, his lifelong passion. Gradually, other men in similar predicaments had found the place. Not by accident, but because Harold had started actively seeking out people like them, elderly men abandoned, forgotten, rejected by their families. "We are not an official organization," Harold explained as he showed Walter some of the ongoing projects. "We are just a group of blokes who've refused to fade away quietly." And it was then that Walter Harrison discovered what his new purpose in life would be. A purpose that would not only change his life but would transform the entire community in ways no one could have ever fathomed. 3 months after that frosty December night, Walter Harrison had become the heart of something extraordinary. What had begun as a makeshift haven for abandoned elderly men had blossomed into a movement that was reshaping the entire community. Walter discovered that his carpentry background, coupled with his newfound understanding of the sting of abandonment, made him uniquely qualified to lead something revolutionary, a program where forgotten seniors built homes for families in need. "You see," Walter had explained to Harold and the other 6 men who now gathered in the workshop daily, "we are not useless. We have decades of experience, skills that took a lifetime to hone. Why are we letting it die with us?" The idea was simple yet profound: leverage the skills of abandoned seniors to build hope for others who had also been overlooked by society: homeless families, single mothers, struggling veterans. The first project was a modest home for Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old single mother of 2 young children who had lost her house in a fire. The family was living in a temporary shelter, and social services had been unable to secure a permanent solution. Walter and his crew, now affectionately dubbed the Forgotten, embarked on the project with minimal resources. They utilized donated timber from local businesses, borrowed tools, and most importantly, decades of collective building expertise. "Every plank we lay," Walter would say as they worked, "is proof that we are still useful. Every nail we drive is a declaration that we exist." The work was far from easy. Walter still grappled with the limitations from his stroke, Harold suffered from severe arthritis, and the other men faced their own age-related health challenges. But something magical was unfolding. The more they built for others, the more they rebuilt themselves. You can feel the transformation happening, can't you? When we find a purpose that transcends ourselves, when we use our pain to help others, something powerful occurs within our souls. Walter and his friends were discovering that being forgotten by family didn't mean being forgotten by the world. The story began to gain traction when a local reporter, Lisa Chen, heard about a group of abandoned seniors who were building homes pro bono for families in need. Initially skeptical, Lisa visited the workshop expecting to find an interesting but small story. Instead, she found something extraordinary. Walter, with his straightforward honesty and obvious passion for the project, told his story, from being abandoned in a storm to discovering he still had much to offer the world. "My son thought he was getting rid of a problem," Walter told the camera, his calloused hands gripping a hammer as he spoke. "But he really set me free to find my true purpose." The report Lisa produced went viral. The headline was simple yet powerful: "The Forgotten: How Abandoned Seniors Are Rebuilding Their Lives by Building Homes for Others." In the days following the report, the workshop was flooded with offers of help. Construction companies donated materials, younger volunteers offered to assist with heavier tasks, and crucially, dozens of other seniors in similar situations showed up wanting to participate. But the most surprising impact came from an unexpected source: the men's families. David, Walter's son, appeared at the workshop a week after the report, visibly uncomfortable but determined. "Dad," he said, interrupting Walter as he worked on a window, "I need to talk to you." Walter looked at the son who had abandoned him 4 months prior. But instead of the anger or bitterness David expected, he saw something different in his father's eyes: peace. "David," Walter said calmly, continuing his work, "you did me a favor that night. You forced me to discover that I still have value, I still have contributions to make. Thank you." David was stunned. He had come prepared to apologize, to try to convince his father to come home. Instead, he found a man who had discovered something David had never seen before: true purpose. "But Dad, you're living in an abandoned workshop, working without pay, with men you barely know." "I'm living," Walter gently interrupted. "For the first time in years, I'm actually living. I'm not a burden to anyone. I'm helping people. I'm making a difference." David looked around the workshop, saw the other men working with purpose and satisfaction, saw the photos of the families who had received homes, saw the genuine transformation that had occurred in his father. "Dad," David finally said, "I made a terrible mistake. Not just abandoning you, but failing to recognize that you still had so much to give." Walter stopped working and looked directly at his son. "David, you taught me something important that night. You taught me that my worth isn't dependent on being convenient for my family. My worth comes from using my skills to help others." He paused, then continued, "If you want to be a part of my new life, you're welcome. But if you're here out of guilt, you can leave. I don't need your approval anymore to know that I'm worth something." A year after that abandonment in the storm, Walter Harrison had become a nationally recognized figure. The Forgotten had built 17 houses, created a nationwide network of similar workshops, and more importantly, proven that abandoned elders could transform into valuable resources for their communities. The program had inspired legislation for better elder support, changed nursing home policies, and created meaningful employment opportunities for thousands of older people. But for Walter, the greatest victory wasn't the public recognition. It was the letter he received from Sarah Martinez, the first mother who had received a home. "Mr. Walter, you saved my family. But more importantly, you taught us that even when the world forgets us, we can still choose not to forget each other." Walter Harrison discovered that being abandoned by his family was the best gift he could have received, because it forced him to discover that his worth didn't come from being convenient for others, but from using his skills to serve humanity. Today, at 75, Walter still gets up every day at 6 a.m., heads to his workshop, now a proper building with community funding, and continues to build homes and rebuild lives. And David? He now works alongside his father every Saturday, learning not just carpentry, but the true value of human resilience. Sometimes, being abandoned by those we love is exactly what we need to discover that we never needed their approval to be worth anything. Thank you for allowing me to share Walter Harrison's story with you. If it has changed anything in your perspective on aging, purpose, or human endurance, then Walter has fulfilled his objective once more, to inspire others to find value in themselves, regardless of circumstances.